So now we are in the final section of the Diadochi Wars from Kings and Generals, the Ptolemaic-Seleucid Syrian Wars. So yeah, let's wrap this up, guys, shall we?
While the official end of the Wars of the Diadochi was the Battle of Kurupedion, there were many more wars amongst the successor dynasties. We have already discussed the wars that occurred in Greece and Anatolia in many of our other long-form series, which you should check out. There are also almost no sources on the wars that occurred when the Greco-Bactrian kingdom seceded from the Seleucids. This leaves a series of wars that are seldom mentioned but are very interesting, despite the sometimes sparse sources, the Syrian Wars between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid dynasties on and off from 274 BCE to 168 BCE. These occurred mostly in the Near East and caused much havoc in the dynastic politics of both empires. Syria, with its economic might and large cultural and agricultural hubs, was bound to be the center of the conflict, as both large empires were going to fight over the region. The roots of the war can be seen as early as 301 BCE, when Syria was divided between Seleucus and Ptolemy. Neither side was ready to really wage a war over the Levant, because they both had personnel issues and their empires were not fully consolidated yet. It is also the case that the Greek colonists that often assisted both dynasties had only just begun to arrive, and thus their military numbers were still small. Ptolemy had acquired Palestine and Coele-Syria, while the north was under Seleucus's control, and both began to send settlers into their respective regions and build settlements to consolidate their control in the Greek manner. Seleucus had hoped to gain Coele-Syria, but was unable to do much in military terms, thus allowing the status quo to solidify. Seleucus built cities in Iraq, western Iran and Syria, bringing Greeks in and trying to accommodate some local elites. Meanwhile, Ptolemy invested in retaking Cyprus, something he did in 294 BCE. Eventually, the two kings died, and their sons, Ptolemy II and Antiochus I, took over. The two sons were more determined to try to fight for Syria and secure the Fertile Crescent for their empires. A sort of Cold War occurred in southern Asia Minor between the two, as Ptolemy II tried to stir up trouble and gained some influence in the region. At the same time, Antiochus was trying to consolidate the massive Seleucid realms fully. In 274 BCE, a war began between the two empires over Syria. This war is not well attested, but we have a few clues as to what occurred. It seems that Antiochus began to penetrate into Syria's south, in response to a confident onslaught by Ptolemy II. The Ptolemaic first strike must have been fast, but no major cities appear to have been sacked. Antiochus's counterstrike must have been well manned, as it seems to have pushed into Ptolemaic Syria. Ptolemy had control of the seas, which assisted him in having steady supply lines, but he is also described as being in the Nile Delta overseeing defenses, suggesting that the Seleucids arrived deep into the Sinai. Another aspect of the war was the incursion of the Cyrenaean king Magus. Cyrene was a kingdom in modern-day Libya with Greek kings, and Magus's mother had married into the Ptolemies. Thus, as a pretender to the throne, Magus invaded Egypt in 274 BCE, but the Hellenistic pharaoh pushed him back. Eventually, a stalemate was formed. The Seleucids were pushed out, and some Ptolemaic influence over southern Anatolia was formed. The Ptolemies claimed victory, and their endurance can be said to be a victory of sorts. Ptolemy II managed to strengthen his rule, while the Seleucids were on more shaky ground. We know nothing of the peace, but it seems that both leaders honored a pledge to not attack each other. This pledge held until 260 BCE. In the meantime, Ptolemy II managed to project some of his power in Greece by sending fleets to the Black Sea for incursions. As Ptolemy was busy in the Cremonideian War, Antiochus was building up his kingdom's military might. The two kingdoms continued in their arms race, each side conquering surrounding regions like the expedition of Ptolemy II into Nubia and its partial colonization, and the Seleucid incursions into Asia Minor. In 260 BCE, with the death of Antiochus I, his son Antiochus II reached an alliance with Antigonus Gonatas. The two kings had common interests. Antigonus wanted to get rid of Ptolemy in the Cremonideian War, while Antiochus II held Ptolemy responsible for turmoil in Pergamon. Thus, the war was initiated in Asia Minor. This is the war of which we know the least. What we do know is that the war started in Ephesus. There were battles on two fronts. in Ionia, where local polis were fought over by the two powers and Antigonos, and in Syria, where more conventional warfare took place. The Ptolemies, if archaeological hoards hidden in haste are to be believed, must have rampaged through southern Anatolia and have even threatened coastal cities like Antioch. In Ionia, Rhodes defeated the Ptolemies at Ephesos in 258 BCE, and also in Kos sometime between 261 and 255 BCE. Ptolemy managed to instigate a revolt in Corinth in 253 BCE, breaking off the Macedonian involvement, and then managed to negotiate peace via a marriage alliance. The Ptolemies had lost territory in Asia Minor, but had decided to achieve peace by sending Ptolemy's daughter, Berenike Syria, to be married to Antiochos II. To marry Berenike, Antiochos even annulled his marriage to Laodike, a Greek noblewoman from Asia Minor.
Are you ready to see your brand on TV?
Ptolemy II was left in Egypt to lick his wounds and reconsolidate his rule, renewing treaties and visiting local oracles to gain political favor. He seemed determined to regain what he had lost, and he was willing to bide his time to do so. He would not live to see it, as he died in 246 BCE and was succeeded by his son, Ptolemy III Euergetes. However, in Seleucid Persia, things were continuously unstable. Revolts in Bactria and Chorasmia were paving the way for the rising sons of the Greco-Bactrian and the Parthian empires. Antiochos seemed more concerned with his Anatolian and Syrian territories, but he died in 247 BCE. This may have been via poisoning from his former wife Laodike, who was furious at being repudiated. However, Antiochos was moving back to the realms he had given her after annulling their marriage, so she used this to try to get her son on the throne. Thus, the power vacuum was left to both Laodike and Berenike Syria and their sons over who was to rule. Berenike had one ace up her sleeve. Her brother was the pharaoh of Egypt. Thus, she called him to her aid, and the Third Syrian War, or the Laodicean War, began. Ptolemy III launched an offensive via sea and land, and tried to reach the enemy territory. Various small skirmishes occurred, such as a Seleucid raid in Sully in Cyprus, and the stealing of treasures from the Acropolis there. By the time Ptolemy arrived at his landing spot near Antioch, termed Seleucia in Perea, his sister had been assassinated. This is despite her cultivating circles amongst the elites of Antioch. But it seems Laodike was a fierce political operator. Ptolemy was
yeah, Laodike ain't messing around. What's the saying? Hell have no fury like a woman scorned. She's going for it. And it's always interesting to see women kind of take center stage, because it's usually, a male-dominated world, especially, around this time, right? So it's cool to see, just women when they get involved and become, giant players in the game of politics. It's just always so interesting to see. Yeah, women can be as ruthless as men in many regards. In fact, probably sometimes even more, so, dang Laodike, chill,
Thus, in a precarious situation, he had to try to narrow his focus to the royal succession line and try to garner local support, as there was no indication people wished to be conquered by the Ptolemies at this time. Laodike organized the coronation of her son, Seleucos II, and then coalesced her forces together. Meanwhile, the Ptolemies were negotiating with pro-Berenikean forces to try and fight off the Laodicean partisans. Upon hearing of the coronation, and due to threats of sedition in Egypt, Ptolemy sent off an order for his allies to evacuate northern Syria while approaching governors in Cilicia. Meanwhile, Seleucid forces marched on Hellespont to break off the region from being accessible to the Ptolemies, who had been active in the region. This seems to have been a failure, as the Seleucid navy was shipwrecked in the Hellespont. Then the Ptolemies went on the offensive. Many commanders, including the half-brother of Ptolemy III, Ptolemy Andromacho. The Navarch moved across Asia Minor and gained control of coastal towns like Ephesos. He was, however, defeated by the Seleucid ally Antigonos Gonatas in the Battle of Andros, with Ptolemy escaping to Ephesos and the Cyclades being lost. Back in the Orient, the Ptolemies were ravaging Syria and taking over lots of territory, with the famous Xanthippos of Carthage as a possible commander of these forces. The Seleucids were also in tatters. Laodike had forced Seleucos II to co-rule with his brother Antiochos Hyrax, or the Hawk, and the latter was causing trouble. While Seleucos had recovered some territories, Antiochos declared independence and crowned himself king of Asia Minor. Thus, negotiations with Ptolemy were in order for Seleucus to try and control the wayward dominions of Anatolia. The treaty secured the borders of the ceasefire. Seleucia in Perea had been retained by the Ptolemies, while the parts of northern Syria that had been recovered were retained by Seleucus II. With the end of the war, the internal politics of the Seleucid Empire continued to be unstable. Seleucus...
Yeah, the Seleucid Empire is so large, you know? And yeah, it's interesting to see, like, further east it's losing even power, and you've already seen the loss in terms of further east, and even now they're still only really focusing westward. And again, the Ptolemies, man, the Ptolemies, they lasted the longest, you know? So it's cool to see this rivalry between the two.
II fought against his brother, Antiochus Hierax, in the War of the Brothers, and lost the Battle of Ancyra in 239 BCE. In the east, the first incursion of the Parthians was going remarkably well, and they were overrunning Iran. Seleucus moved eastwards to stop them, while Antiochus continued to fight against regional kings for control of Asia Minor, like the newly minted Attalid dynasty. This failed spectacularly, and he left for refuge in Armenia. His dreams of winning back the throne in Syria were crushed in 226 BCE, when he died in Thrace. Seleucus managed to repel the Parthians and hoped to do the same in Asia Minor.
Yeah, it's so weird to see the baby Parthians, because we know they're gonna end up beefing with the Romans so later on. It's cool to see their origins from eating the Seleucid Empire, you know? It's good. It's just interesting to see Parthia there.
Against the Attalids. This, however, did not come to pass, as he died in 255 BCE. In his place, his son Seleucus III, and then another son called Antiochus III, rose to the throne.
Yeah, we know Antiochus III, who, you know, I was a bit mean to when we watched the video about the Roman conquest of Greece by kings and generals. Like, dude, like, this guy got wrecked, and he did. It was a bad showing. Like, the Romans completely demolished him. But, yeah, I have looked into a bit of his exploits before his disastrous war with the Romans, and yeah, I can definitely see why he's called the Great. You know, he is impressive. It just happened that, you know, the Romans were just on another level.
Determined to achieve victory. He initiated military operations and managed by 221 BCE to regain control over Media and Persia and defeat the rebellious governors. In Ptolemaic Egypt, things were starting to not go smoothly. While the empire was doing well, local revolts emerged in the 240s BCE, and Egypt was involved in wars in Greece. Ptolemy's death in 221 BCE brought forth a weaker ruler, Ptolemy IV. The first couple of years of his reign were full of court intrigue between his family members, resulting in his mother, Berenike, being murdered, his sister, Arsinoe II, marrying him, and Greek nobles influencing him.
Incest! Yeah, I always joked about the Ptolemies and their incest, but it's interesting that it has finally made its debut. We have entered incest mode, you know? Cleopatra and Ptolemies for like 10 family generations.
This was an opportunity for Antiochus, who had neutralized his own enemies in court early on in his reign. He prepared carefully for war, but his initial attempts in 221 BCE did not come to fruition, as the local generals managed to push him off. 2 years later, however, the local generals, like the Aetolian Theodotos and Panaetolos, felt distant from the unstable Egyptian courts. Thus, in 219 BCE, they allowed Antiochus to enter Phoenicia, and he managed to take northern Syria under Seleucid control. After this, Antiochus tried to solidify control over the region before moving forward. A momentary truce allowed both sides to regroup, but Antiochus was bound to attack after the winter of 219 BCE. One of Ptolemy's courtier puppeteers, Sosibios, began a bold new recruiting tactic. He began to recruit both Greek and native Egyptian phalangites, breaking a previous norm of ethnic segregation. This empowered the Ptolemaic army, because many of the northern generals had deserted to Antiochus's side. The latter moved into the southern territories in 217 BCE and began to march towards Gaza. The Ptolemies rose to the challenge, and the debts were to be settled in the Battle of Raphia, or Rafah, in 217 BCE. The battle took place on June 22, 217 BCE, and our source, Polybius, provides it in some detail. The Ptolemaic force included 75,000 infantry of both Greeks and Egyptians, as well as Libyans and other ethnicities, alongside 5,000 cavalry and 73 African war elephants. The Seleucids included 62,000 infantry of Greeks, Arabians and other ethnicities, 6,000 cavalry and 102 Asian war elephants. This was the first engagement where African and Asian war elephants faced each other in battle. The first days of the battle involved sporadic conflict. Eventually, on the fifth day, the armies began to march forward. The phalanxes were at the center. The Ptolemaic cavalry was on the left, opposite the Seleucid cavalry. The light mercenaries were on the other side, on the right flank, opposite the Seleucid mercenaries. The elephants had been placed at the front, and the two pachyderm lines marched towards each other first. Eventually, the African elephants saw their Indian cousins were far larger than them and began to panic. This caused chaos in the front row, and then Antiochus's cavalry moved forward against Ptolemy's. The chaos caused by the elephants forced Ptolemy's cavalry into retreat. Ptolemy's right flank was in a better position. The commander, Echecrates, ordered an attack and pushed through the enemy, managing to break the Seleucid flank. At the same time, Ptolemy IV moved to the center, where his Egyptian and Macedonian phalanxes had been placed, and rallied them forward. They crashed into the Seleucid phalanxes and silver shields, and the battle in the center continued in close quarters combat. Antiochus was busy fighting off the Ptolemaic cavalry and managed to succeed in this endeavor. However, he then turned away and saw that Ptolemy's phalanxes had succeeded in pushing off his own phalanxes. He dashed back to try to regroup the phalanx, but it was too late. His troops had fled back to the north. The battle had been a success for the Ptolemies, as Antiochus took refuge alongside his troops in the city of Gaza. He negotiated a truce that solidified the front line. The south of Coeli Syria was left to the Ptolemies, while he retained control of the north. The Fourth Syrian War had been yet another stalemate, with many victories for the Seleucids, but ultimately a defeat in the final push. Despite their success in fending off the Seleucids, the Ptolemies were growing ever more unstable, while Antiochus...
Man. Dang, Antiochus, man. I'm telling you, like, definitely impressive, but then you see him take L's, big major L's, you know?
went off to deal with revolts by separatist generals like Achaeus. Ptolemy IV left his courtier puppet masters, like the noble Thosibios, to sort out the game of politics. The Ptolemies did try to help some anti-Seleucid separatists, like Achaeus, and continued to be involved in conflicts in the Aegean. But things were brewing in the kingdom itself. Besides animosity between Greek and Egyptian subjects, which Ptolemaic efforts, like calling themselves pharaohs for the first time after Raphia, tried to cease, the unusual court intrigue continued. A revolt even took place in Upper Egypt, where the lowest number of Greek settlers lived, and it was filled with nativist rage against Hellenic colonial presence. With the death of Ptolemy IV in 204 BCE, the court factions exploded into conflict once more. Thosibios and another regent called Agathocles murdered Ptolemy's wife Arsinoe and then held the regency while Greco-Egyptian relations deteriorated. The regents hoped to maintain their control by paying the Egyptian priestly elites, but peasants and citizens subject to heavy taxation eventually revolted. Agathocles was lynched in Alexandria. The chaos allowed for a perfect opportunity for Antiochus to invade Coeli Syria once more. He called on his ally, Philip of the Antigonids in Macedon, to invade a...
Alright, we've come full circle. This is where the Greek, where the Roman conquest of Greek video, remember? When we saw that, this situation set up, and then this is where Rome and Macedon start fighting, and now where Rome begins its rise as the power of the world, the new power, you know.
Asia Minor. The Macedonian obliged, and the wheels for the Second Macedonian War began to unwind, which we have covered in another video.
The new bearskin hoodie...
On the Oriental front, Antiochus initiated his invasion in 202 BCE. His fortified cities in the north provided an excellent way forward. Thus, he powered down south and took Damascus, before moving down south towards Palestine. He ended up being delayed in Gaza as he besieged the city until 201 BCE, but eventually he took it and moved down southwest as the Ptolemies scrambled to subdue the southern rebellion. Things boiled over in 200 BCE when a mercenary general of the Ptolemies, Scopas of Aetolia, faced the Seleucid Antiochus in the Battle of Panium. The Seleucid troops in Panium were once more led by Antiochus III and his young son Antiochus the Younger. They commanded 70,000 men as well as elephants. Opposing them was a 4-kilometer-long line of 46,500 to 53,000 men under Scopas, both infantry and cavalry. The enemy troops were divided by a stream in the center of the river. Before the battle, Antiochus the Younger took his elite cavalry unit, the cataphracts, during the night and took a hilltop fort in Mount Hermon. The next day, the battle commenced, and said cataphracts managed to rout
Literally flanked them. The oldest trick in the book.
the Ptolemaic cavalry. In the center, Scopas and the Aetolians proved their skills in battle by pushing off the Seleucid forces. However, the Seleucids were both numerically superior and had a better arsenal. The Seleucid elephants fought their Ptolemaic enemies in the north, and once more, Indian prevailed against the African pachyderm. Then both the cataphracts and the elephants turned towards the center. They surrounded the Aetolians, and thousands of them perished on the spot, though numbers range from 17,500 to 20,000 phalanx soldiers. Scopas was on the right flank and fled with his cavalry to Sidon, where they remained under siege until their surrender in 198 BCE. The Seleucids weighed their options after this victory. They could have invaded Egypt, but they received envoys from the rising power of Rome urging them not to do this due to the grain disruptions it could cause. Thus, they focused their efforts on raiding and capturing Asia Minor territories controlled by the Egyptians. The Ptolemies, by 195 BCE, were eager for peace, which was achieved after a marriage alliance between Ptolemy V, the heir who had risen to the throne after his father's death, and the Seleucid princess Cleopatra I. Thus, the Ptolemies lost Coele-Syria and returned to focusing on the Egyptian revolt, which was now run by priestly elites and had taken a nativist element. Despite their victory, the Seleucids soon faced a twin threat: the Romans, who defeated them and forced them to sign a treaty in Apamea in 188 BCE, and the resurgent march of the Parthians in the east. The Ptolemies fought the wayward nativist kingdom in the south until 185 BCE, when they managed to reconquer the territories. Antiochus IV Epiphanes succeeded his brother in 175 BCE, while Ptolemy V died in 180 BCE. Cleopatra tried to keep the peace in Egypt and avoid any overtures to reclaim Coele-Syria, something her husband had wished to do before he died. However, when she died in 176 BCE, her son Ptolemy VI was under the influence of local courtiers. Slowly, war began once more in 170 BCE, but we know little of what transpired to cause it. The Seleucids managed to take the gateway to Egypt, Pelusium, and Antiochus went as far west as Naucratis and dangerously close to Alexandria. The unrest in Egypt erupted once more, and the courtiers who controlled Ptolemy, Euleos and Lennios, were killed, and in their place came Cineas and Komnenos. It seemed that Egypt was partially occupied, and that Antiochus tried to impose a certain Ptolemy Physcon, brother of the ruling Ptolemy, as client king. However, trouble in Phoenicia led to Antiochus's withdrawal, and this led to the two brothers tagging together against him. Antiochus returned, took Cyprus, managed to retake Memphis, and even tried to besiege Alexandria once more. However, the Roman eagle would not tolerate an empire in the east growing too powerful. They issued an ultimatum to Antiochus via a certain Popilius Linnaeus, who told him to relinquish all he had conquered in the 6th Syrian War and to allow the Ptolemies to stay independent. Fearful of Rome, who had just won the Battle of Pydna, Antiochus relented in what came to be known as the Day of Eleusis.
Man, in the grand scheme of things, the Alexander through the Hellenistic era really didn't last that long until the Romans showed up. And it's just so funny, the Romans come out of nowhere and start just telling people what to do, and everyone does it. Like, they really just came out of nowhere and proved to be the true superpower of the world, while everyone else was fighting. Like, man, it's good to see you, Rome. You're already here, and you're already the biggest player in the game. Like, man.
In 168 BCE, the war officially ended. Both Egypt and Syria would face regionalist revolts after, the Maccabean revolt for the Seleucids, and a revolt by Dionysios Petroserapis for the Ptolemies. This 6th Syrian war is technically the last one. The scholar John D. Granger also included 3 more wars in the Seleucid dynastic wars, during which the Ptolemies sent troops to assist one side. However, as those are technically another conflict altogether, and as they overlap with the Roman wars of conquest of the East in the 2nd century BCE, they are not discussed here. Likewise, we'll leave out various Ptolemaic civil wars and revolts by natives because they involve a different political background from the one that caused the Syrian wars or the wars of the Diadochi. War would continue in the Eastern Mediterranean, but the states that had been forged at the start of the wars of the Diadochi were now very different. The long aftermath of the wars of the Diadochi was finally over, and the Hellenistic age had reached its zenith. As the wars have now ended, let us take stock of the geopolitical landscape the Diadochi left in their wake. The Ptolemies in Egypt were very much consolidated, and had begun their grand project of building a Greek-centered rule over the proud Egyptian people. They slowly built Greek settlements and expanded the city of Alexandria, becoming a naval Silk Road hub. They used Hellenic culture as a quasi-colonial force upon Egypt, but slowly took up more Egyptian characteristics. They fought many wars over Phoenicia and Judea with the Seleucids, and tried to control Cyrene to their west, which lasted until the Battle of Actium. Meanwhile, the Lysimachian heir, Ptolemy Epigonos, tried to claim the Macedonian throne, but failed, ending up in Egypt. His kingdom was split between Macedonian and Seleucid dynasties, as well as small statelets like the Thracian kingdom of Bithynia. The biggest of these, the Attalids in Pergamon, became a wealthy cultural hub. The rest of Asia Minor became a battleground between the Kingdom of Pontus, run by Greco-Iranian dynasties like that of Mithridates the Great, who was famous for fighting the Roman general Pompey, and other small statelets that emerged, like the Kingdom of Commagene, which also merged Greek and Persian religions. Over in the Greek mainland, the Antigonids ruled over Macedon and had various phases of oscillating control over the rest of Hellas in various wars. In the century after the Diadochi Wars ended, the Roman Republic slowly appeared in the region and eventually overtook and annexed Hellas. As for the Seleucids, they built a massive empire over the Near East and Persia, and constructed local social networks with local elites to keep control over that vast land. Slowly, and in wars with Scythians and Parthians, Persia came under the control of the Parthian dynasty or other local rulers. In the Far East, one of the satraps of the Seleucids, Diadotos I, broke off and founded the Greco-Bactrian kingdom in modern Afghanistan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. The history of this kingdom, mostly known through coinage, is known for both wars with nomadic tribes, but also for prosperity, and cities like Icarium, where Greek and Persian architecture merged in elite houses. The southern part of the Greco-Bactrians broke off in the 2nd century BCE. It formed the first of many Indo-Greek kingdoms, which ruled over Taxila, where Porus once ruled, and even fought wars with Indian empires like the Shunga. All of the easternmost Hellenic kingdoms merged Indian, Greek and Persian cultures, and were eventually overrun by the Indo-Scythians, Indo-Parthians and Kushans. Ultimately, the Hellenistic era, which began with the wars of the Diadochi, continued until the conquest of Greece by Rome. Alexander's last words, "to the strongest," ended up causing 40 years of fragmentation and titanic clashes. It was an era of colonial tensions, where Greeks ruled over many foreign peoples. However, it was also an era of cosmopolitanism, where Greeks and foreign peoples mingled and made hybrid innovations in philosophy and culture. This era lasted as long as the wars had, with constant conflict and crumbling empires. And yet, it also included the glories of the cities of Alexandria and Antioch, of Taxila and Icarium, without which some of the most important developments in Eurasia would not have occurred, from Hellenistic Judaism and early Christianity to Stoicism and Epicureanism. This was an age of beauty, cosmopolitan mixing, and cultural production, which is best summarized by the Persian Timurid poet Hafiz, who, living in a similarly cosmopolitan world, says in his poem, A New World, As dust, O west wind, let us rise to the heavens, floating free in Creator's glow of elation. If mind desires to return while heart cries to stay, here's a quarrel for love's deliberation. Alas, these words and songs go for naught in this land. Come, Hafez, let's create a new generation. More videos on the history of ancient Greece are on the way. To make sure that you don't miss them, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would not be...
We've done it, my friends. We have covered all of the Diadochi through Alexander the Great. This was a journey. Now we have to leave Greece and move on to other things. But man, I will say that this was a great series. Honestly, this was the series... Alexander through Diadochi is a series I wanted to cover so much last year. Obviously, I had other series and videos to cover, but this is the one I've been waiting for over a year to cover, and we finally covered it, and I loved every minute of it. I love learning about the Diadochi. Alexander, Greece is just my favorite. Right now, I'm a huge nerd for the Greeks, and I'm obsessed with them and their history, so... Again, this was just great. Kings and Generals has solidified himself as my favorite historical YouTuber. I love his team, his work, and I just really love it all. So this was just wonderful. I loved this series. I loved all of it, and I'm gonna be a little sad to part with it, but oh well. You know, that everything comes to an end eventually, and yeah, but I'll remember this one fondly for many years to come. So, until tomorrow, my friends.